Hello, this is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and what I'm going to do right now is start to embark upon another series of video presentations I'm going to do based on here the PowerPoint slides for the book that will be used for the Rankin Technical College AWD or Application and Website Development 1100 C# Programming Fundamentals class. The book, FYI, the book is Murock's C# 2015 by Ann Bain and Joel Murock. And don't let the fact that it says 2015, scare you into thinking that, oh my gosh, it's so old, it won't be any good, etc., etc. All right? It is about a 4-year-old book. All right? That said, the stuff that's in it is very much up to date. It's a good book. There are 26, to my knowledge, chapters in this book. This is the only time I'm going to do this. I hope to, plan to, go over all 26. Does that mean we will go over all 26 chapters as a class? Of course not. There's not enough time in an 18-week semester. But I would like to cover all 26 and have at least 26 of these presentations. But starting it at the beginning. Chapter 1 is on how to get started with Visual Studio. Now, I'm doing this, for lack of better words, I'm not saying I'm not prepared, but I've paged through the book, but I haven't read it in detail. But I will start by saying that if you go out to visualstudio.com/downloads, what you'll find there, amongst other things, is a free download of the Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition. If you have not done that already, you should do so. All right. So let's jump into the book. Here's our objectives for Chapter 1. I don't like sitting there and reading them to you. But the idea is for you to start getting used to using Visual Studio. And in our case, again, it's Visual Studio 2019, not 2015. All right? So we'll talk about the stuff that's in here. I will tell you that as far as using the Visual Studio IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, I can lecture all I want to. You can listen all you want to. But until you sit there and actually practice using it, the editor probably won't make a lot of sense. By the time you finish this class, you'll be able to write programs like this one, for example. And you'll be able to write something like this way before the class ends. All right? Now, I've had people over the years say to me, Jeff or Mr. Scott or whatever, I really want to get into programming, I really want to get into IT, but I don't do math. Well, first of all, yes, you do. I had a guy who told me that he wanted to be a game programmer, but he said, I hope I don't have to do any math because I don't know math, I don't do math. What do you think game programming is? The idea, if you look right here, this says that if you invest $100 at 8% for 10 years, that at the end of that 10 years, this is what you'll have. All right? At least that's the way that I read it. Now, that said, is that big a thing? Not at all. But the point is, once you put this in, and you've got the underlying code written, you aren't doing the math. You're telling the computer how to do the math. All right. Common types of .NET applications. Go ahead and read this by yourselves. And I will tell you that the first one, Windows Forms, that's what the AWD1100 C# Programming Fundamentals class that I'm doing these presentations for, that's what it's about. We don't do anything anymore on ASP.NET Web Forms. That's how we used to run the class that follows this, AWD1100 Framework with Web Databases. That class is now a class in ASP.NET MVC or Model View Controller. Any work that we do with WPF, which I think is Windows Presentation Foundation, but any work we do with that is minimal at best. So, we're 2019, remember, not 2015, and we will be using the Community Edition. In particular, we will be using Visual C#. I won't say a word, except in passing maybe, about Visual Basic or Visual C++ or Visual F#. It's all C#. Here's the .NET Framework. Do you need to know this? Not at all. The point is, as you go down what's shown here, it's closer to the machine level, and as you go up what's shown here, it's closer to the human level. So we will be working in this class exclusively on Visual C#. But in order to do that, we will need to use some of the stuff from the .NET Framework. All right? The .NET Framework, for it to be able to do its thing, may need to interact directly or indirectly with the operating system and the hardware. All right. Once we start to create applications, this is what our window will look like. We'll have a toolbar over here. We'll look at it, I think, more in the next chapters. All right. We have a thing over here called the Solution Explorer, which is kind of like a Windows Explorer. We've got a thing over here called the Properties window. So if I click on something in here, for instance, if I clicked on this white box after the words monthly investment, this would change down here to a text box, and it would be called whatever this was called. And again, if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. How a C# application is compiled and run. Again, it's kind of an amalgamation or a combination of you writing code using the Visual Studio IDE or Integrated Development Environment. That code must be compiled, and it's compiled using the .NET Framework and the Common Language Runtime. From there, you will get an assembly. In other words, before this program can run, it'll be put into what's called IL, and I don't really even agree with that. Typically, I see it put in there as MSIL, where the MS stands for Microsoft Intermediate Language. All right? When we bring Visual Studio up, we're going to get a start page. It won't look exactly like this because, again, this is a 2015 page. We'll be working with 2019. When we come in to open up an existing project, it will look pretty much like this. You'll see all this stuff. It'll make much more sense as we actually start doing. All right? Every C# project has a project file. That's true. It can have more than one project file in what's called the same solution. So Visual Studio C# project exists inside of a Visual Studio C# solution. Again, that solution can have one project file or multiple project files. As the author says here in this third bullet, when you open a project file, Visual Studio opens the solution that contains the project. The project file can be stored in the same directory as the solution or in a subdirectory. It's not, in the end, it's not that big a thing. This is what's called the form designer. We've already looked at it. What's different from this slide as opposed to this one that we looked at, notice right here, stuff looks pretty normal, but down here, it's got all these dots and stuff. And all that means is we highlighted all of this. Okay, that's it. Again, this is the form designer. Behind the form designer is what's called the code editor. That's where you write the code. So in other words, if I want something to happen when I click the calculate button, I've got to put code in the code window for the calculate button. There's an example. If I want the program to stop running when I click the exit button, I've got to put code behind or inside of, however you want to look at it, that exit button. You are going to see this as we go along with it. You take my word for it, because we will. This again is the Solution Explorer. So this is what you see right over here. The Solution Explorer has the name of your solution and then all of the projects that exist inside of that solution and all of the files that exist in the projects. Things like references, which we'll go over later, C# files, form files, etc. All right, project files. The Solution Explorer uses different icons to show what's what. Each form, it says, is defined by 2 C# source files, where each of these files contain a partial class. There's a file with a .cs extension, CS for C#. As it says, it contains the code entered by the programmer. There's another file that's going to be called designer.cs. You can look at that file. You should never, ever, ever change anything that's on that file, because that's code, for lack of a better word, that's written by the system, not by you. A source code file that doesn't define a form is usually stored in a single C# source file that contains a single class. That can be the case, but it is possible for you to create what's called a console application, and those console applications can have many C# source files and have many classes in them. You'll see that later on. The program.cs file, that contains the start instructions, or whatever you want to call it, so that when the program starts to run, it's got the steps in there that should be followed. The references that I showed you before, where was that? That's these files in here. They are files that allow you to bring in pre-written information, so stuff that Microsoft has already created that you can use in your program. All right. These windows that I showed you before, this Solution Explorer, when I showed it to you before, was up here. That Properties window was down here. This Form Designer was over here. These windows all float. When you use them like this, they are all docked. In other words, they're put in a position. But you can move them around if you're so inclined. I would recommend not doing that as we start out. But later, if you want to, you can. Not going to go over anything on this particular slide. All they show you in there is how you can move around windows. So again, if you decide, you know what, I really wish this Properties window was on this side and the Solution Explorer was over here, etc., you can move that stuff around any way you'd like. So the idea is you run your program, and this is the form that runs, or the one that's displayed when you run the program. And how do you run that program? See that green button right there? You click that, where it says Start. You click on there. You could also do a build or a debug. There's different ways of doing it, and we'll talk about some of those as we get into it. All right? But clicking that green button that I just showed you is the easiest way. All right. The dialog box for upgrading a project, we shouldn't have to worry about that. If that becomes an issue for any reason, we'll talk about it at that time. Okay? So that's it for the first chapter. Welcome to the class. Welcome to the textbook. All right? C# is, in many ways, it's a really terrific language. It's got a lot of really good features. When I come back in just a minute, we're going to go over Chapter 2, which is on how to design a Windows Form application. I'll be back with that shortly.